Chapters 47 to 49, Raymie Nightingale. Here are some questions to think about as I read. How did Raymie save Louisiana? What made Raymie's soul feel huge inside her? Who is Ruthie? What did Raymie tell her about her father? Why didn't Raymie want to go home? How did Louisiana get Archie back? Chapter 47. Louisiana wasn't breathing, and Beverly was crying, which was almost as terrifying as Louisiana not breathing. And the swan was still trying to stretch his head right off his neck. He was leaning forward and looking at them and hissing. Bunny was sniffing around Louisiana's head, snuffling her barrettes and letting out low moans. Louisiana was stretched out in the grass by the pond, which was really a sinkhole. The yellow lights stood around them, looking down at them, waiting. Raymie turned Louisiana over. She turned her head to the side. She beat on her back with her fists. Mr. Stephanopoulos had taught her how to save a drowning person, how to get the water out of someone's lungs, and she did everything he had taught her to do. She remembered it all. She remembered it in the right order. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" shouted Beverly. Bunny moaned. The swan hissed. The yellow lights shone down. "What are you doing?" asked Beverly, still crying. Raymie pounded on Louisiana's back. A flood of water, also a few pond weeds, exited Louisiana's mouth in a great rush. Then there was more water and more water and more water, and another weed. Then came Louisiana's squeaky, hopeful voice saying, "Oh my goodness." Louisiana's soul was huge inside of her. She felt a tremendous love for Louisiana Elefante and for Beverly Topinski and for the hissing swan and the moaning dog and the dark pond and the yellow lights. Most of all, she felt love for the furry toed and furry-backed Mr. Stephanopoulos, who was gone, who had moved to North Carolina with Edgar, the drowning dummy. Mr. Stephanopoulos, who had put his hand on her head and told her goodbye. Mr. Stephanopoulos, who had taught Raymie how to do exactly this, how to save Louisiana Elefante before he went away. "The hospital," said Beverly. They picked Louisiana up together and started walking. They had gotten good at carrying her. They went up the hill, and Bunny followed them. The swan stayed behind. Louisiana said, "I can't swim." "Yeah," said Beverly, "we know." Beverly, who was still crying. Chapter 48. There was a nurse standing outside the hospital doors. She was smoking a cigarette. Her left elbow was cupped in her right hand, and she was holding the cigarette and staring at the four of them as they came up the hill. "Oh, my Lord," said the nurse. She slowly lowered the cigarette. She had a name tag on that read Marceline. "She drowned," said Beverly. "She didn't drown," said Raymie. "She almost drowned. She swallowed water." "I have swampy lungs," said Louisiana. "I can't swim." "Come here, baby," said Marceline. She dropped the cigarette and took Louisiana from them and carried her through the automatic doors. Beverly sat down on the curb. She wrapped her arms around Bunny and buried her face in his neck. "You go," she said. "I'm going to sit out here for a while." "Okay," said Raymie, and she walked through the doors. She went up to the nurse at the front desk and asked if she could use the phone to call her mother. This nurse had a name tag that said Ruthie. Raymie thought about how nice name tags were. She wished that everyone in the world wore them. "Look at you," said Ruthie. "You are soaking wet." "I was in the pond," said Raymie. "It's 5 o'clock in the morning," said Ruthie. "What was you doing in a pond at 5 a.m.? "It's complicated," said Raymie. "It has to do with a cat named Archie, who got taken to the very friendly animal center and what?" Raymie tried to figure out how to explain it. She realized that she didn't even know where to begin. She was cold all of a sudden. She started to shiver. "Have you ever heard of the Little Miss Central Florida Tire Contest?" she asked. "The what?" said Ruthie. Raymie's teeth were chattering. Her knees were knocking together. It was so cold. She began again, and then suddenly she knew exactly what she needed to tell Ruthie. My father ran away. He ran away with a dental hygienist named Leanne Dickerson, and he isn't coming back. That skunk, said Ruthie. She stood up and came out from behind the desk. She took off her sweater, which was a blue sweater like the one Martha at the Golden Glen wore. She draped the sweater over Raymie's shoulders. The blue sweater smelled like roses, and something deeper and sweeter even than roses. It was so warm. Raymie started to cry. Shh, shh, said Ruthie. Tell me your mama's phone number and I will call her. Okay, yes, good morning, said Ruthie when Raymie's mother answered the phone. Everything is just fine. I have your baby girl here at the hospital. There's nothing to worry about except that she is soaking wet because she's been swimming in a pond. Also, she told me about how her daddy run off with some woman named Leanne. Ruthie listened. Mm-hmm, she said after a minute. She listened some more. Uh-huh, said Ruthie. Some people just skunks. There ain't no other way to say it. Outside the glass doors, Raymie could see Beverly sitting on the curb. Her arm was around Bunny. There was lightness in the sky above their heads. The sun was going to come up. You don't have to explain it to me, said Ruthie, still on the phone with Raymie's mother. I understand all that. Yes, I do. But your baby girl is here, and she is just fine, and she is waiting for you. Chapter 49. Things happened fast then. Adults showed up. Raymie's mother arrived and pulled Raymie into her arms and held her close and rocked her back and forth and back and forth. Beverly's mother showed up and sat next to Beverly on the curb, the dog in between them. And after a while, Louisiana's grandmother arrived too. She was wearing her fur coat, and she sat beside Louisiana's bed and held her hand and cried without making any noise at all. Raymie told the story of what had happened again and again, how the shopping cart had gone into the water, and how Louisiana couldn't swim, and how Raymie had pulled her out of the water and pounded her on the back, and how that was something that she had learned from a man named Mr. Stephanopoulos, who taught a class called Life Saving 101. A reporter from the Lister Press showed up. Raymie spelled Elefante for him. She spelled Stephanopoulos. She told him that Clark had an E at the end of it. The reporter took Raymie's picture. And the whole time, Louisiana was asleep in a white hospital bed. She wasn't talking. She had a high fever. But she would be fine. Everybody kept saying that she would be fine. It was Ruthie who said, "This child needs to sleep. Everybody needs to stop asking her questions and let her go home and sleep." But Raymie didn't want to go home. She wanted to be where Louisiana was. So Ruthie brought a cot into Louisiana's room, and Raymie lay down on it. She fell asleep right away. When she woke up, Louisiana was still sleeping. Louisiana's grandmother was still wearing her fur coat. She was still holding Louisiana's hand, and she was asleep too. The hallway outside of the room was lit up, shining with afternoon light, just like the common room at the Golden Glen. Raymie got up and stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the bright and shining path. A cat was walking toward her. Raymie stood and stared. The cat came closer and closer. Raymie recognized him from her dreams. She recognized him from Mrs. Borkowski's suitcase. It was Archie. The cat brushed past her. He came into the room and leaped up on Louisiana's bed and curled himself into a tight ball. Raymie went and lay back down on her cot. She fell asleep again. When she woke up, it was dusk, and Archie was still curled up at Louisiana's feet. He was purring so loudly that the hospital bed was shaking. Archie, king of the cats. He had returned. Louisiana's fever broke that night, and she sat up in bed and said, "Oh my goodness, I'm hungry." Her voice was scratchy. Then she looked down at her feet and saw the cat. "Archie," she said, as if she wasn't surprised at all. She bent forward and pulled him into her arms. She looked around the room. She said, "And there's Granny." And she looked at her grandmother, who was sleeping in the chair beside the bed. And then Louisiana looked at Raymie and said, "Raymie Nightingale, there you are, too." "Here I am," said Raymie. "Where's Beverly?" "She's at home, taking care of Bunny." "Bunny," said Louisiana in a voice of wonder. "We saved Bunny. Remember how we saved him?" Ruthie came into the room and said, "How did that cat get in here?" "He found me," said Louisiana. "I lost him. He lost me. We went looking for him, and he found me." Louisiana closed her eyes and saw Mrs. Borkowski opening the suitcase and pulling Archie out of it. "It's kind of a miracle," she said. "Ain't no miracle," said Ruthie. "It's just a cat. That's how they do."